On August 3, 1944, Heinrich Himmler told Nazi leaders in Posen that the Stauffenberg family would be extinguished down to the last member. Exactly 50 years later, the son of the man who tried to kill Hitler retired from the German army as a major general after 38 years in uniform. He was 10 years old when his father was executed. Because Hitler didn't just punish the men who tried to kill him, he went after their children. 46 of them would eventually pass through a hidden children's home, stripped of their names, and ordered to forget who they were. This is what happened to them. The name that became a death sentence, Stauffenberg, a name the family had carried for centuries. On July 20th, 1944, a briefcase exploded under a map table at the Wolfslayer in East Prussia. 4 men died. Hitler survived with minor injuries, burns, bruises, and a damaged eardrum. Shortly after midnight, Colonel Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, 36 years old, having lost his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers of his left hand, stood in the courtyard of the Bendele block in Berlin, lit by the headlights of army trucks. A firing squad raised their rifles. His final words are generally remembered as, "Long live sacred Germany," and this is where most stories about the July 20th plot end. But Hitler didn't think the punishment was finished, because in his mind, and in Himmler's, the crime didn't belong to one man, it belonged to a bloodline. The Nazis revived an old idea rooted in Germanic law, Sippenhaft, kin liability. The principle was simple and brutal. If one member of a family was accused of treason, the family itself could be punished. Not just the conspirators, their wives, their parents, their siblings, their children. Within days, the Gestapo began arresting relatives across dozens of families, grandmothers, pregnant women, elderly men who had never heard the word Valkyrie in their lives. And on August 3rd, Himmler stood before the assembled Gauleiters in Posen and announced the regime's new policy of kin liability. The Stauffenberg family, he declared, was to be extinguished down to the last member. The regime had already decided what to do with the children. The name that disappeared, a 10-year-old boy, is told a sentence that will define the rest of this story. From today, you are no longer called Stauffenberg. The Stauffenberg family estate at Lodlingen, southern Germany. 4 children: Berthold, age 10, Heimerin, 8, Franz Ludwig, 6, Valerie, 3. Their mother, Nia, pregnant with a 5th. Nina was arrested while still pregnant. She was taken first to Rottweil, then Berlin, and eventually to Ravensbrück, where she spent months in solitary confinement. Her mother, Anna von Lerchenfeld, was also caught in the family arrests. She would die in captivity in February 1945 after contracting typhus. The children remained behind temporarily, under guard. 2 Gestapo officials were billeted inside the house and watched them. Berthold, the 10-year-old, remembered it for the rest of his life. "We were isolated even from our playmates in the village. We felt like outcasts from society. I will never forget that feeling. Only one outsider was allowed near them, the village priest. And he quietly told the children something that could have cost him his life. Never forget what your father died for." Then, the regime finally came for them. On August 17, 1944, the 4 Stauffenberg children arrived at a children's home in the Borntal, a quiet valley outside the spa town of Bad Saxe, in the Harz Mountains. 7 cottages, sealed off from the world. Over the following months, 46 children connected to the July 20th plot would pass through this home. The oldest was 15, the youngest was barely a month old. Siblings were deliberately separated, split into different houses by age and gender. No letters, no visits, no contact with the outside world. The children didn't know if the mothers were alive. Their families didn't know where the children were. And then came the moment that gives this story its spine. The children were stripped of their family names and given new identities. One of the girls, the daughter of an executed officer, later remembered being assigned the number 26, with the stranger's name Schultz written on her little hairbush. "That feeling of losing your own self," she said, decades later, "I have never overcome it." For the 4 Stauffenberg children, the new surname was Meister, and the plan went further than anyone imagined. The regime intended to place the children with loyal German families under their new identities, raise the traitors' children as perfect National Socialists, erase the bloodline not by killing it, but by converting it. But there was one problem with the plan. One member of the Stauffenberg family was still too valuable for the Nazis to destroy. The woman the Nazis couldn't afford to lose. The Reich erased names it hated, but one name it needed, and she knew it. Her name was Melita von Stauffenberg, married to Klaus's older brother, and the man who rode to town for the first time in January was the last name of 12 years. The Reich disappeared. Melita was one of the most skilled test pilots in the Luftwaffe, a dive bomber specialist who personally flew more than 2,000 test flights, many of them near vertical dives that had killed other pilots. She held the rank of Flugkapitän. She wore the Iron Cross. She also had Jewish ancestry under the Nazi racial classification system. Her father's parents were Jewish. And here is the contradiction at the heart of this story. The same regime hunting the Stauffenberg bloodline had granted an exemption to a woman whose own ancestry it considered racially dangerous because it could not afford to lose her skills. After July 20th, that protection collapsed. Melita was arrested under Sippenhaft along with her husband Alexander, who had known nothing about the plot. He was serving in Greece when the bomb went off. It didn't matter. The family connection was enough. But Melita's importance to the Luftwaffe gave her leverage. She was released so she could return to her test flight work, and that freedom gave her something almost nobody else had: access. She used it to find her imprisoned family. By Christmas 1944, she had reached Bad Satza and visited the children, bringing presents and news they had been desperate to hear. Their mother was alive. For children who had spent months cut off from the outside world, it was the first proof they hadn't been swallowed completely by the dark. Meanwhile, the adults who had given these children their names were disappearing. At Plötzensee, the People's Court continued condemning conspirators to death. Klaus's older brother Berthold was executed there on August 10th. The machinery of Sippenhaft kept moving. The Reich believed it was winning. Then, on January 27, 1945, the very day Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz, in a Nazi maternity facility in Frankfurt an der Oder, a prisoner transferred from Ravensbrück gave birth to a baby girl. Nina von Stauffenberg named her daughter Constanza. Himmler had promised that the Stauffenberg family would be extinguished down to the last member, but while his regime was still hunting the family had just grown. And in the final weeks of the war, the Nazis made one last decision about the children who were still being held, a decision that would send them toward Buchenwald. The children who were supposed to disappear. By the spring of 1945, the children had spent months living under names that were not their own. The erasure was exactly what the regime had intended. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing on every front. Soviet armies were driving west. American and British forces were pushing toward the Rhine. And yet, and this tells you everything about the nature of the regime, even as its cities burned, the machinery of Sippenhaft kept running with meticulous bureau character. So, this reason, which is the most critical discovery, the adult relatives of the plotters were now being shuffled across a shrinking Reich like pieces the regime refused to put down. From February 1945, members of the Stauffenberg family were held in a special isolation barrack inside Buchenwald concentration camp. They were separated from the main prisoner population, not simply as ordinary prisoners, but as hostages, valuable because of who their relatives were.
Think about that. What was it possible for mobilizing mattresses?
The same names the regime had promised to extinguish were now being preserved because they might be useful when the end came. Nina was caught in the same hostage system. In the final weeks of the war, she and other family prisoners were evacuated south through the collapsing Reich, eventually toward the Alps. And the children in Bad Satza? For months, they had lived in a strange, suspended world. No parents, no letters, false names. The staff waited for orders. Berthold, 10 years old, now officially Berthold Meister, described it later with a sentence that is more chilling than any atrocity. We were simply being stored. Nobody really took care of us. Everyone was waiting for orders. Stored, like files, like evidence. For months, their real names remained forbidden. Their family photographs were gone. Their siblings were separated. Their parents were somewhere beyond the walls, and the children were expected to answer to names that were not theirs. Then, in the final weeks of the war, the orders finally came. By the time the final transport was arranged, only a small group of children remained in the Borntal. They were to be taken to Nordhausen and sent by train to Buchenwald, the same camp where members of their own family were already being held. The journey began on April 3, 1945. The children were loaded onto a Wehrmacht truck and driven toward Nordhausen. They were supposed to board a train there. But before they could reach Buchenwald, something happened that the Nazis could not control. An Allied air raid hit Nordhausen. The railway infrastructure was destroyed. The route to Buchenwald was broken. The truck carrying the children turned around. The order that was supposed to make the children disappear died at a bombed-out railway station. They were taken back to Bad Satza, and on April 12th, American troops entered the town. The guards were gone. The Nazi officials were disappearing. The war that had controlled every part of their lives was collapsing around them, but their real names would not officially return for several more weeks. Meanwhile, the woman who had fought hardest to reach them was running out of time. Melita von Stauffenberg had spent the final months of the war using every advantage she had to track down her imprisoned husband, Alexander. She flew toward Buchenwald, followed the trail as the prisoners were moved south, and kept trying to reach him. On April 8th, with the Reich collapsing around her, Melita took off again. An American reconnaissance aircraft attacked her plane near Strasskirchen in Bavaria. She crash-landed alive, but died from her injuries. About 2 hours later, she was 42 years old. She had outmaneuvered the Gestapo, the racial laws, and the Sippenhaft decree. She could not outmaneuver the last weeks of the war, and Alexander was still alive. In the final days of April, he and other prominent prisoners were moved south with the SS hostage convoy, through the collapsing Reich and toward the Alps. In early May, German officers intervened against the SS guards. On May 4th, American troops took custody of the prisoners in South Tyrol. Alexander had survived, but by the time he was free, he had lost almost everything. His twin brother Berthold was dead. His younger brother Klaus was dead, and the wife who had spent the final months of the war trying to find him had been killed less than 4 weeks before his liberation. Nina survived too, but the family reunion did not happen all at once. The children were finally brought out of Bad Satza. Nina and baby Constanze were still making their own journey home. Piece by piece, the family began finding one another again. By the summer of 1945, Nina and her 5 children were finally together again at Lautlingen. The Nazis had taken their home, they had taken their father, they had taken their names, but they had failed to take the family. And on May 8, 1945, the children at Bad Satza officially received their identities back. The name Stauffenberg had survived. But surviving the war was only the beginning, because the children were going home to a Germany that had to decide what their fathers had been, traitors or heroes, and that question would follow them for decades. The names return. In 1944, Germany tried to erase the name Stauffenberg. After the war, it took years for Germany to decide what that name meant. When the war ended, the families of the July 20th plotters did not suddenly come home as heroes' families. For many post-war Germans, the old accusation of treason survived. The men of July 20th had been called oath-breakers by Hitler's regime, and that word followed their families into the new Germany. Some widows of executed plotters were initially denied the pensions paid to other military widows. Children could be taunted at school for having the wrong father. One boy experienced it in 1954. His mother came home from a parents' evening in tears. His teacher had told her, "Being the son of a traitor, it is no wonder he fails at school." Think about that. These children had survived the Gestapo, the false names, the Borntal, and the threat of Buchenwald, only to discover that the word traitor had followed their fathers home. The turning point came in 1952, when the question finally reached a courtroom. A former Wehrmacht officer named Otto Ernst Remmer, the commander whose troops had helped suppress the July 20th coup in Berlin, was publicly calling the conspirators traitors. Braunschweig prosecutor Fritz Bauer prosecuted him for defaming the men of July 20th, and the trial became something much larger than a case against one former officer. The court declared that resistance against the Nazi regime had been legitimate and described the Nazi state itself as an unjust criminal regime. For the first time, a German court had publicly challenged the legal and moral foundation of the Nazi verdict against the plotters. Slowly, painfully slowly, the name began its journey back. In 1955, the street outside the Bendler block was renamed Stauffenbergstrasse. The courtyard where Klaus had been executed became a place of remembrance. Over the following decades, the German Resistance Memorial Center grew around the site. But the most extraordinary restoration of the name happened somewhere else. It happened in the lives of Klaus's 5 children. Each one answered the question differently. Astor Berthold, the eldest, the 10-year-old from the Borntal, gave perhaps the most astonishing answer of all. In 1956, he joined the brand new Bundeswehr. Read that again. The boy whose father had been executed by German soldiers, on German army orders, in a German army courtyard, put on a German uniform. The new Bundeswehr represented something his father's army had failed to be, a military bound to the democratic state rather than to one man. Berthold served for 38 years. He commanded armored reconnaissance units, rose through the ranks, eventually became commander of Territorial Command South, and retired in 1994 as a major general. He was described as Germany's longest-serving soldier after 38 years in the Bundeswehr. Himmler had promised the name would be extinguished. Instead, it spent nearly 4 decades on the shoulder boards of a German general. Franz Ludwig, the 6-year-old from the Borntal, chose another part of the new Germany, democracy itself. He became a lawyer, then entered politics with the Bavarian CSU. From 1976 to 1987, he served in the Bundestag. He later served in the European Parliament, including as a member of its Legal Affairs Committee. The son of a man who died trying to destroy a dictatorship, spent decades inside the democratic institutions built to make another dictatorship harder to create. Heimaren, the 8-year-old, chose something quieter. He became a businessman and largely stayed outside public life. No parliament, no military career, no need to turn his father's name into a public identity. After a childhood in which the state had taken away his name, perhaps an ordinary life was its own kind of freedom. And then there was Al-Rai. Born on November 15, 1940, her father's own birthday, she was only 3 when Klaus was executed, too young to remember him. She married Heino von Lestock in 1964. 2 years later, on June 4, 1966, she died in Munich of leukemia. She was 25. The Gestapo had failed to destroy her. Leukemia did what the regime never could. And then came Constanza, the baby born in captivity on January 27, 1945, the child who existed as living proof that Himmler's promise had failed. She grew up in Switzerland, where she completed her schooling and eventually built her adult life. In 1967, she married Dietrich von Schulhess-Rechberg. For decades, she largely stayed out of the spotlight. Then, in 2008, she did something none of the other children had done. She wrote a book about her mother. Not Claus, not the bomb, not Operation Valkyrie. Nina Schenk Gräfin von Stauffenberg, a portrait. The book became a bestseller in Germany. And suddenly, the country was reading about the woman behind the famous name, the pregnant wife, imprisoned after the plot, the mother separated from her 4 children, and the woman who spent the rest of her life raising the family Hitler had tried to erase. Because Nina was the quiet giant of this story. She never remarried. She raised her 5 children. She answered their questions about their father. And she lived long enough to see the name restored, the memorials built. One son become a general, another become a parliamentarian, and her youngest daughter write her story. Mina died on April 2, 2006, at the age of 92. She was the last surviving half of the marriage that had produced the family Hitler tried to erase. She had outlived the Reich by 61 years. But the final revenge against the Nazi attempt to erase the name wasn't a courtroom. It wasn't a memorial. It wasn't even a general wearing the name on his uniform. It was this. Every July 20th, the Bundeswehr returns to the Benleblock. Young recruits gather in the same complex where the conspirators were arrested and where Stauffenberg was executed. They make their pledge to serve the Federal Republic and defend the rights and freedoms of the German people. The difference could not be more deliberate. The Wehrmacht had sworn personal loyalty to Hitler. The Bundeswehr binds its soldiers to the democratic state, and its soldiers are expected to think for themselves and refuse unlawful commands. The courtyard where Klaus von Stauffenberg was shot is now a place where German soldiers publicly commit themselves to the values his regime had destroyed. Himmler had promised the name would be extinguished. It wasn't. The children survived. The name survived. And eventually, the country that had once called their father a traitor built a tradition around remembering why he resisted.